Hello everyone. In tonight's mystery, we present the Iron Mask case. A mysterious prisoner held in secrecy for decades, forced to wear a mask, his true identity still unknown, and theories more bizarre than the tale itself. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight you'll hear it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, lie back, listen closely and drift off as the mystery unfolds. St. Mars had grown accustomed to the weight of secrets, but this particular prisoner pressed against his conscience like a stone in his boot. For 34 years, he had shepherded this masked figure through 4 different fortresses, watching the man's shoulders gradually bow under the accumulated burden of anonymity. The Iron Mask itself, contrary to popular imagination, was actually black velvet, lined with whalebone and secured with a silver clasp that caught the morning light streaming through the Bastille's narrow windows. The prisoner's morning routine never varied. He would rise at dawn, perform his ablutions with the meticulous care of a man who understood that dignity lay in the details when everything else had been stripped away. His hands, St. Mars had noticed, bore the soft calluses of someone who had once handled documents extensively, yet they moved with the practiced precision of a swordsman. This contradiction had puzzled the governor for decades. What haunted St. Mars most was the prisoner's voice. When he spoke, which was rare and only to him, it carried the unmistakable cadence of court education, each syllable weighted with the authority of someone born to command. Yet there was something else, a subtle accent that suggested foreign tutoring, perhaps Italian or Spanish influence. The prisoner's French was perfect, but it was the perfection of study rather than nativity. The morning of September 19th, 1703 began differently. The prisoner had requested paper and ink, breaking a silence that had lasted nearly 3 years. St. Mars hesitated, remembering the explicit instructions from Versailles. No writing materials, no visitors, no opportunity for communication beyond the essential. But the man's recent illness had left him gaunt, and St. Mars found himself moved by an unexpected compassion. "You know I cannot permit this," he said, his voice softer than protocol demanded. The prisoner turned toward the window, his masked profile creating a stark silhouette against the grey morning. "I do not seek to send messages, Monsieur de St. Mars. I merely wish to order my thoughts. A dying man's privilege, perhaps." The words carried a finality that chilled the governor. He had seen many prisoners face death, but this man's acceptance held a resignation that spoke of deeper wounds than physical illness. St. Mars found himself wondering, not for the first time, what crime could warrant such elaborate punishment? What sin demanded not just imprisonment, but the complete erasure of identity? Later that evening, St. Mars made his customary rounds. The prisoner had died quietly, sometime between Vespers and Compline, seated in his chair facing the window. His masked face remained turned toward the courtyard, where other prisoners took their daily exercise, as if he had been watching lives he could never join. The governor's fingers trembled as he reached for the silver clasp, but he stopped himself. Even in death, the mystery would remain inviolate. The funeral arrangements were as peculiar as the man's life had been. The body was buried quickly in the cemetery of St. Paul, under the name Marchioli, a name that meant nothing to anyone, including St. Mars. The gravestone bore no dates, no epitaph, just the single word etched in plain letters. The mask was burned, its ashes scattered to the wind from the Bastille's highest tower. Yet questions lingered like smoke in the governor's mind. Why had Louis XIV personally overseen every detail of this prisoner's custody? Why had the Sun King's instructions been so specific about the mask, about the prohibition on viewing the man's face? St. Mars had served the crown faithfully for 40 years, but this secret felt different, heavier somehow, as if it contained the power to shake the very foundations of the realm. As he prepared his final report to Versailles, St. Mars found himself hesitating over the usual formalities. The prisoner was dead, but the mystery lived on, passed now to whoever would read these carefully worded dispatches. He wondered if future generations would ever unravel the truth, or if the masked man's identity would remain forever lost in the labyrinthine corridors of royal discretion. The candle flickered as he sealed the letter, casting dancing shadows across the walls of his study. Outside, Paris slept, unaware that one of its greatest enigmas had quietly slipped into history. 23 years earlier, in a sun-drenched villa outside Madrid, a young man named Eustache Dorga received a letter that would alter the course of European history. The parchment bore the seal of Nicolas Fouquet, the former superintendent of finances, whose spectacular downfall had shaken the French court to its foundations. Dorga, serving as valet to the Duke of Mantua, had been carefully cultivating relationships with Spanish nobility, his true allegiance hidden beneath layers of practiced deception. The letter was brief, written in a cipher that Dorga recognized immediately. Fouquet, imprisoned in the fortress of Pignerol, was requesting a service that would require all of Dorga's accumulated skills in espionage and subterfuge. The disgraced minister had discovered something during his imprisonment, a document that revealed the true parentage of a child born to Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, Louis XIV's wife, in 1661. The implications were staggering. If this child was not Louis XIV's offspring, but rather the result of a liaison between the Queen and her Spanish confessor, the entire succession of the French throne could be thrown into question. More dangerously, if the child still lived and could be proven legitimate, it would provide Spain with a potential claimant to the French crown, a living weapon in the ongoing struggle between the two powers. Dorga's investigation led him through the shadowy networks of Spanish intelligence, where he encountered a Jesuit priest named Father Pregnani. The priest, uneasy and evidently unfamiliar with international intrigue, held documents that validated Fouquet's assertions. But there was more. Much more. The child had not died in infancy, as court records suggested, but had been spirited away to a monastery in the Pyrenees, where he had been raised in ignorance of his true heritage. The young man, now approaching his 20th birthday, bore an uncanny resemblance to Louis XIV, so striking that it could not be mere coincidence. His facial features were almost identical to the Sun King's, down to the distinctive Habsburg chin inherited from his Spanish mother. This resemblance was precisely what made him so dangerous and so valuable. Dorga's handler in Madrid, a spy master known only as El Conde, saw immediately the potential for chaos. If this young man could be placed at the French court, even briefly, the resemblance alone would fuel rumours and conspiracy theories that could destabilise Louis XIV's reign. The Spanish crown, still smarting from territorial losses in the recent war, was eager to employ any weapon that might weaken their French rivals. But Dorga had his own agenda. Years of serving multiple masters had taught him that few in his profession could afford loyalty. He began to consider a different approach, one that would serve his interests while potentially benefiting France. If he could capture this dangerous pretender and deliver him to Louis XIV, the reward would be substantial. More importantly, it would secure his position within the French intelligence apparatus. The plan Dorga devised was elegant in its simplicity. He would approach the young man, claiming to be an agent of the Spanish crown with orders to bring him to Madrid to claim his rightful inheritance. The naive monastery-raised youth would likely trust him, having no experience with the treacherous world of international politics. Once in Dorga's custody, the journey would mysteriously redirect toward the French border. However, as Dorga prepared to implement his scheme, he discovered that others were also moving pieces on this particular chessboard. A group of Spanish nobles, led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had learned of the young man's existence and were planning their approach. Their goal was more ambitious. They intended to use the pretender as a rallying point for Spanish territorial claims in southern France. The situation became even more complex when Dorga learned that French agents were already aware of the threat. Minister Louvois had dispatched his operatives to Spain with orders to eliminate the problem permanently. Multiple factions were now converging on his remote mountain sanctuary, threatening the young man's life. As autumn approached, Dorga found himself racing against time and numerous adversaries. The stakes had escalated far beyond his original expectations, and he began to realize that his survival might depend on making the right choice in the coming confrontation. The Spanish gambit was about to reach its climax, and the consequences would echo through the courts of Europe for generations to come. The fortress of Pignerol, carved into the Alpine foothills like a crown of stone, had witnessed many secrets during its tumultuous history. But in the winter of 1681, it harboured a mystery that would challenge the very foundations of royal authority. Nicolas Fouquet, the former superintendent who had dared to outshine the Sun King himself, sat in his cell composing what he believed would be his final testament, a document that would either secure his freedom or guarantee his death. Fouquet's fingers, cramped from years of careful penmanship, traced the outline of a hidden compartment he had carved into his cell wall. Within lay the fruit of months of clandestine correspondence with contacts throughout Europe, gathered through a network of servants, guards, and fellow prisoners who had no idea of the explosive nature of the information they carried. The key revelation centered on a series of diplomatic pouches that had been intercepted during Fouquet's tenure as superintendent. Among the routine dispatches between Madrid and Paris lay coded messages discussing the Spanish prince, a designation that had puzzled Fouquet until he began to piece together the implications. The Queen of France, Maria Theresa, had indeed given birth to a child in 1661, but the paternity was far more complex than court records suggested. By meticulously scrutinizing dates, movements, and financial records, Fouquet meticulously pieced together a story that would shock Louis XIV. The Queen, lonely and isolated in a foreign court, had formed a relationship with her Spanish confessor, Father Miguel de Molinos. The resulting pregnancy had been carefully managed to coincide with the king's presence at court, creating the illusion of legitimate royal succession. But the child born of this union possessed features so distinctly Spanish that concerns arose immediately. The infant's survival posed a threat to the carefully constructed mythology of divine right that surrounded the French monarchy. A decision was made at the highest levels of government to declare the child stillborn while secretly arranging for its removal from France. Fouquet's investigation revealed that the child had been transported to Spain under the protection of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a man whose loyalty to the Spanish crown was matched only by his hatred of French expansion. The boy was raised in a monastery and told that he was the bastard son of a Spanish nobleman, unaware of his true heritage and the revolutionary implications of his existence. The former superintendent's research had uncovered another disturbing detail. The child bore a facial resemblance to Louis XIV that was so pronounced it could not be explained by mere coincidence. This resemblance suggested a shared heritage that went beyond their mutual connection to the Queen. Fouquet began to suspect that the Spanish confessor himself might have had some blood connection to the French royal line, perhaps through one of the numerous illegitimate offspring that had peppered European nobility for centuries. As Fouquet prepared to reveal his findings, he became aware that his activities had not gone unnoticed. Pignerol welcomed a new prisoner, a young man with a black velvet mask covering his face at all times. The prisoner's treatment was extraordinary. He was afforded privileges usually reserved for nobility, yet his identity remained completely hidden. Fouquet started to suspect that his own investigations might have a connection to this masked figure. The masked prisoner's mannerisms and bearing suggested aristocratic breeding, but there was something else, a nervous energy that spoke of recent trauma. When he spoke, which was rare, his voice carried the cultured tones of someone educated in multiple languages. Yet there was a haunted quality to his demeanour, as if he carried knowledge that was too dangerous to share. Through the complex system of communication that prisoners develop over time, Fouquet began to piece together fragments of the masked man's story. He had been captured in Spain under mysterious circumstances, brought to France in secret, and imprisoned under the direct orders of the king himself. The level of security surrounding his custody was unprecedented, suggesting that his identity posed a threat to the very stability of the realm. As winter deepened, Fouquet made a connection that deeply chilled him. The timing of the masked prisoner's arrival corresponded exactly with reports of a young man's disappearance from a Spanish monastery. The physical description, gleaned from carefully orchestrated glimpses, matched the accounts of the Spanish prince that Fouquet had been investigating. The former superintendent realized that he might be sharing his prison with the very person whose existence threatened to unravel the legitimacy of the French monarchy. The masked prisoner represented more than just a political inconvenience. He embodied the secrets that powerful men were willing to sacrifice their lives to safeguard. The mask was not merely a punishment, it was a necessity, hiding a face that could topple dynasties. In the shadows of Pignerol, two men carried secrets that could reshape Europe, each unaware of how their fates had become intertwined in the deadly game of royal succession. Father Miguel de Molinos walked through the corridors of the Escorial with the measured pace of a man who had long ago learned to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of pious devotion. The Spanish royal palace, with its austere granite walls and labyrinthine passages, seemed designed to muffle secrets, and Molinos had grown comfortable in its shadowed embrace. What he had not anticipated was the arrival of a French spy who knew far too much about events that were supposed to have been buried with the passage of time. The Jesuit priest paused before a portrait of Queen Maria Theresa, studying the Habsburg features that had been faithfully rendered by court artists. The irony was not lost on him. He had helped create a living version of this portrait, a young man whose existence now threatened to unravel the carefully constructed balance of European power. The child, born of his liaison with the French Queen, carried not just his features, but also the unmistakable stamp of royal blood that made him both precious and dangerous. Molinos had never intended to become entangled in matters of state. His original mission in France had been purely spiritual, to serve as confessor to the lonely Spanish princess, who had been married off to secure peace between two great powers. But Maria Theresa's isolation at Versailles had created an intimacy that transcended the boundaries of their formal relationship. Their connection had been intellectual at first, then emotional, and finally physical, resulting in consequences that neither had fully anticipated. The pregnancy had been managed with the skill of practiced courtiers. Louis XIV's own physician, Dr. Fagan, had been complicit in the deception, ensuring that the timing appeared to coincide with the king's presence. But the child's Spanish features had been immediately apparent, creating a crisis that required swift and decisive action. Within hours of the infant's birth, only a handful of individuals knew the truth, leading to the decision to fake his death. Molinos had watched helplessly as his son was spirited away to Spain and placed in the care of the Benedictine monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña. The arrangement had been presented as a charitable act, the rescue of an orphaned child whose parents had died in service to the crown. The abbot, a man of unquestioning loyalty to the Spanish royal family, had asked no probing questions about the boy's origins or the generous endowment that accompanied his arrival. For 20 years, Molinos had watched from afar as his son grew to manhood, receiving reports from the monastery that described a young man of exceptional intelligence and natural leadership. The boy had been told that he was the illegitimate son of a Spanish nobleman who had died in the wars with France, a fiction that explained both his comfortable circumstances and his uncertain status. He had been given the name Eustache d'Auga, a combination that honoured both his Spanish heritage and his French birth. The deception had worked perfectly until the network of spies and informants that peppered European courts began to notice certain patterns. Fouquet's investigation initially posed a serious threat, but his imprisonment and disgrace effectively contained it. The real danger had come from an unexpected source. Eustache d'Auga himself had begun to ask questions about his parentage, driven by a growing awareness that his physical resemblance to the French king was too pronounced to be coincidental. Molinos had tried to discourage these inquiries, but the young man's persistence had eventually attracted the attention of Spanish intelligence networks. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, ever alert to opportunities that might damage French interests, had seen immediately the potential for chaos. A living claimant to the French throne, even an illegitimate one, could be used to foment rebellion, or at least create sufficient doubt about royal succession to weaken Louis XIV's position. The situation had become even more complex when French agents learned of the threat. Minister Louvois, whose network of spies was arguably the most sophisticated in Europe, had dispatched operatives to Spain with orders to eliminate the problem permanently. The young man's life had suddenly become the focal point of an international incident that could easily escalate into open warfare. But Molinos had received intelligence that suggested an even more dangerous development. French agents had captured the real Eustache d'Auga, the valet who served as a spy for Fouquet, and were holding him in the fortress of Pignerol. His capture meant that two men now bore the same name, one the innocent son of a Spanish priest and French queen, the other a seasoned spy who possessed knowledge that could expose the entire conspiracy. The priest realized that the French authorities had likely confused the two men, or perhaps had deliberately chosen to imprison them both to prevent any possibility of the truth emerging. The masked prisoner that reports described could be either man or both men might be held in separate locations to ensure that their stories could never be compared or corroborated. As Molinos contemplated the terrible irony of the situation, he began to understand that his survival depended on ensuring that neither version of Eustache Dauger ever revealed the truth. The secrets they carried were too dangerous for any of them to survive their exposure. Louis XIV stood at the window of his private study in Versailles, watching the sun set over the geometric perfection of his gardens. Louis XIV, who had dubbed himself the Sun King, was acutely aware of the irony, a crisis that threatened to overshadow his meticulously crafted mythology of divine authority. The dispatch from Minister Louvois lay open on his desk, its contents more disturbing than any military defeat or diplomatic setback he had yet endured. Initially, the discovery of a young man with his facial features in Spanish territory appeared to be a manageable issue. Royal bastards were common enough in European courts, and the resemblance could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking by enemies seeking to undermine French authority. But the accompanying intelligence had painted a far more complex and dangerous picture. The young man was not merely a bastard who happened to resemble the king. According to Louvois' agents, he was the son of Queen Maria Theresa and her Spanish confessor, born in 1661 and secretly transported to Spain to prevent a succession crisis. The implications were staggering. If this information became public, it would not only delegitimize the Dauphin's claim to the throne, but would also provide Spain with a potential weapon that could be used to challenge French authority for generations. Louis had always taken pride in his ability to separate personal emotions from matters of state, but this crisis profoundly affected the essence of his identity. The Queen's betrayal, if true, was a wound that cut deeper than any military defeat. More troubling still was the possibility that the young man's resemblance to him might indicate a blood connection that went beyond their shared relationship to Maria Theresa. The king's private investigations had uncovered disturbing genealogical connections that his historians had previously overlooked. Father Molinos, the Spanish confessor, was descended from a cadet branch of the Bourbon family through his grandmother, a woman who had been the mistress of Louis XIII's younger brother. This meant that the priest carried French royal blood, albeit diluted through illegitimate channels. The child born of his union with the Queen would therefore possess a double claim to royal heritage, making him not just a bastard, but a potential rival with legitimate grievances. The capture of the real Eustache Dauger had provided Louis with additional intelligence about the conspiracy, but it had also complicated the situation immeasurably. The spy's confessions, extracted through careful interrogation, revealed that Spanish agents had been planning to use the young man as a rallying point for territorial claims in southern France. The Duke of Medina Sidonia had been secretly gathering support among Spanish nobles, who still harboured resentment over territorial losses from recent wars. But Dauger's revelations had also exposed a network of French nobles who might be sympathetic to a Spanish claimant. The list of potential conspirators included some of the most powerful families in France, men whose loyalty Louis had never questioned, but whose ambitions might make them receptive to supporting a rival claimant who could advance their interests. The king faced a dilemma that challenged every principle of his reign. The young man's execution would be the simplest solution, but it would also create a martyr whose death might inspire even greater opposition. Also, the execution method must be carefully managed to prevent the body from being examined by those who might recognize the royal features. Imprisonment presented its challenges. Any guard or official would immediately recognize the implications when they saw the young man's striking resemblance to Louis. The solution that had been implemented, the black velvet mask, was both practical and symbolic. It prevented recognition, while also serving as a constant reminder of the terrible knowledge that lay beneath. Yet Louis understood that the mask was only a temporary solution. The young man's very existence represented a threat that would persist as long as he lived. Every day of his continued survival increased the risk that the truth would eventually emerge, either through careless talk among his guards or through the persistent investigations of hostile foreign agents. The king had also considered the possibility of using the masked prisoner as a bargaining chip in future negotiations with Spain. The young man's value as a hostage was considerable, particularly if Spanish agents were indeed planning to use him as a claimant to French territory. But this approach carried its own risks. Acknowledging the prisoner's identity, even in secret diplomatic channels, would confirm the very allegations that Louis was trying to suppress. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Louis made a decision that would echo through the corridors of European power for generations. The masked prisoner would remain imprisoned, his identity hidden, his very existence denied. The secret would be shared only among a handful of the most trusted officials, men whose own survival depended on maintaining the fiction that had been constructed around the mysterious figure. The Sun King had chosen to preserve his dynasty through the systematic erasure of a rival claimant, but he understood that this decision would bind him and his successors to a conspiracy that could never be fully resolved. The masked prisoner would serve as a constant reminder of the vulnerability of royal authority and the high cost of preserving power in a time of secrecy and deceit. The Palazzo Ducale stood reflected in the murky waters of the Grand Canal, its Gothic arches catching the morning light like ancient eyes watching the eternal dance of commerce and conspiracy that defined Venice. Count Antonio Mattioli, the Duke of Mantua's most trusted diplomat, stood at his window studying the coded dispatch that had arrived with the dawn tide. The message, bearing the seal of the Spanish crown, contained information that could either secure his fortune or guarantee his death. Mattioli had built his career on the principle that information was the most valuable commodity in the complex web of Italian politics. His network of contacts stretched from the Ottoman court to the chambers of the Pope, each relationship carefully cultivated to provide him with the intelligence necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of European diplomacy. But the offer contained in this latest correspondence was unlike anything he had previously encountered. The Spanish crown was prepared to pay an extraordinary sum for the delivery of a single individual, a young man currently held in French custody, whose identity was so sensitive that even the dispatch referred to him only as the masked one. The amount mentioned was sufficient to purchase a small duchy, but Mattioli understood that such generosity came with proportional risks. The French were not known for their forgiveness of those who interfered with their state security. The Count's investigations had revealed disturbing details about the prisoner's background. Through his contacts in the Jesuit order, he had learned that the young man was connected to Father Molinos, the Spanish confessor whose relationship with the French Queen had created one of the most explosive scandals in recent memory. The prisoner's physical resemblance to Louis XIV was so pronounced that it could only be explained by royal blood, making him both incredibly valuable and impossibly dangerous. Mattioli's plan was audacious in its simplicity. The fortress of Pignerol, where the masked prisoner was held, was situated in territory that had changed hands multiple times during recent conflicts. The Italian count possessed detailed maps of the region, including passages that had been used by smugglers and refugees during the various sieges. More importantly, he had cultivated relationships with several guards at the fortress, men whose loyalty could be purchased for the right price. The timing of the proposed rescue was crucial. Intelligence suggested that the French were planning to transfer the masked prisoner to a more secure location, possibly the Bastille in Paris. Once the move was completed, any rescue attempt would become infinitely more difficult. The window of opportunity was narrow, perhaps only a few weeks during which the prisoner would be vulnerable to a carefully orchestrated extraction. But Mattioli had not survived decades of Italian politics by acting impulsively. His own investigations had revealed that the Spanish offer was not the only game being played around the masked prisoner. French agents were actively seeking to eliminate potential threats to their security, and the Count's inquiries had likely attracted their attention. More troubling still, he had detected signs that other parties were also interested in the prisoner's fate. The Venetian Republic, ever alert to opportunities that might advance their interests, had apparently learned of the prisoner's existence through their intelligence networks. The Doge's agents had approached Mattioli with a counter-offer. They would support his rescue attempt in exchange for the prisoner being delivered to Venice rather than Spain. The Republic's interest was purely strategic. They saw the masked man as a potential tool for disrupting the balance of power between France and Spain. The Count found himself at the centre of a complex web of competing interests, each faction seeking to use him to advance their agenda. The Spanish wanted the prisoner as a potential claimant to challenge French authority. The Venetians viewed him as a valuable tool for future negotiations. The French, of course, wanted him dead or permanently silenced. Mattioli began to realise that his survival might depend on playing these factions against each other, rather than committing fully to any single course of action. Examining the architectural plans of Pignerol, Mattioli discovered a detail that previous intelligence reports had missed. The fortress contained a series of underground chambers that had been constructed during the medieval period, long before the current security arrangements had been implemented. These chambers connected to natural caves that extended beyond the fortress walls, potentially providing a route for extraction that would avoid the heavily guarded main entrances. The Count's network of contacts included a group of former soldiers who had served in various conflicts throughout northern Italy. These men, scarred by years of warfare and motivated primarily by financial gain, possessed the skills necessary to execute a complex rescue operation. More importantly, they had no political loyalties that might compromise the mission or expose Mattioli to future blackmail. But as the Count refined his plans, he began to suspect that his activities had not gone unnoticed. French agents had been asking questions about him in various diplomatic circles, and several of his usual contacts had become suddenly unavailable. Realizing that he might already be under surveillance compelled him to re-evaluate the entire operation. Executing the masked prisoner's rescue with precision was crucial, as it could potentially lead to his own imprisonment or death. The Venetian gambit was about to begin, but Mattioli understood that he was wagering not just his fortune, but his life on the outcome of a game whose rules were written by men who would not hesitate to sacrifice him if it served their purposes. The year 1703 brought an unusual warmth to the stones of the Bastille, as if the fortress itself were preparing for the end of its most enigmatic chapter. Saint-Mars stood in the courtyard, watching the masked prisoner take his final walk in the autumn sunlight. The man's gait had grown unsteady recently, his once proud bearing now bent with the weight of 34 years of anonymity. Yet there remained something indefinably regal in his movements, a quality that had never diminished despite the systematic erasure of his identity. The governor had received new instructions from Versailles, orders that carried the unmistakable tone of finality. The prisoner's health was failing, and the king's ministers had decided that his death should be carefully managed to prevent any posthumous revelations. The mask that had hidden his features for so long would be destroyed, his body buried under a false name, and all records of his true identity would be sealed in the royal archives in perpetuity. But Saint-Mars had been keeping his own records, a private journal that documented the small details of the prisoner's daily life. The man's habits, his preferences, and his reactions to news from the outside world. All these fragments painted a portrait of someone who had once moved in the highest circles of European society. The prisoner's knowledge of courtly etiquette was impeccable, his understanding of diplomatic protocols comprehensive, and his reactions to news of Spanish affairs particularly intense. The breakthrough had come through an unexpected source. Father Griffith, the Jesuit priest who served as the prisoner's confessor, had inadvertently revealed details that confirmed Saint-Mars' growing suspicions. During the prisoner's final illness, when fever had loosened his tongue, he had spoken in his delirium of memories that could only belong to someone who had lived at the very heart of royal power. He had mentioned specific events, private conversations, and intimate details about the French court that no ordinary criminal could have known. Most revealing of all, the prisoner had spoken of his mother, not in the vague terms of distant memory, but with the specific grief of someone who had been forced to abandon a beloved parent. He had described her voice, her hands, and her particular way of blessing herself before meals. The details were too precise, too emotionally charged to be fabrications. Saint-Mars had begun to understand that the masked prisoner was not merely someone who resembled the royal family, he was a member of it. An aging servant who had worked in the royal nursery during the 1660s had provided the final piece of the puzzle. The woman, now in her 70s and dying of consumption, had sought out St. Mars to unburden herself of a secret that had tormented her for decades. She had been present at the birth of a child to Queen Maria Theresa in 1661, a child whose Spanish features had immediately marked him as different from the Dauphin, who had been born the previous year. The servant's account corroborated the intelligence reports that St. Mars had been piecing together. The child had been declared stillborn, but she had seen him breathing and had watched as he was spirited away by figures she had not recognized. The official records had been falsified, the attending physicians sworn to secrecy, and the entire incident buried beneath layers of royal protocol and state necessity. But the servant's revelation had contained an additional detail that reframed the entire mystery. The child's father was not Father Molinos, as the intelligence reports had suggested, but Louis XIV himself. The Queen's relationship with her Spanish confessor had been real, but it had been a spiritual rather than physical connection. The child bore Spanish features because he had inherited them from his mother, but his resemblance to the king was unmistakable because Louis XIV was indeed his father. This revelation transformed the prisoner's story from one of illegitimate birth to one of legitimate succession. The masked man was not a bastard who threatened the dynasty. He was a rightful heir who had been sacrificed to maintain the fiction of royal perfection. His imprisonment was not punishment for his mother's adultery, but protection for a state secret that could have destabilized the entire kingdom. The child's Spanish appearance had been deemed unacceptable for a future king of France. In an age when royal marriages were diplomatic instruments and royal children were symbols of national identity, a dauphin who looked more Spanish than French would have been a constant reminder of France's subordinate position in the marriage alliance. The decision to hide his existence had been made not from shame, but from political necessity. St. Mars realized that the prisoner's education and bearing made perfect sense in this context. He had been raised by carefully selected tutors who had trained him for a role he could never claim, educated in the arts of kingship, while being permanently denied the throne. The cruelty of this arrangement was breathtaking, to create a perfect prince and then condemn him to spend his life hidden behind a mask. As the prisoner drew his final breaths, St. Mars understood that he was witnessing the end of one of history's most elaborate cover-ups. The man dying in the Bastille was not a criminal or a spy, but a king who had never been allowed to rule. His death would close the final chapter of a story that had begun with the political calculations of absolute monarchy and ended with the quiet tragedy of a life sacrificed to the needs of state. The mask that had hidden his features would be destroyed, his grave would bear a false name, and history would remember him only as a mystery. But St. Mars knew the truth, and he understood that the real tragedy was not the prisoner's death, but the kingdom's loss of what might have been its greatest king. While passengers slept in their cabins on the night of April 14th, 1912, 5 men worked tirelessly in the belly of the Titanic, surrounded by 3,423 sacks of mail destined for New York. The ship's postal clerks, John Starr March, William Logan Gwynn, Oscar Scott Woody, John Richard Jago Smith and James Bertram Williamson, represented an international crew from America, Britain and Belgium, united by their dedication to the Royal Mail Service and the United States Postal Service. When the collision occurred at 11:40 p.m, these men didn't panic or abandon their post. Instead, they made a decision that would define their final hours. They would save as much mail as possible. Water began flooding the mailroom within minutes of impact, rising rapidly through the lower decks. The postal workers immediately began hauling mail sacks from the flooding G deck to the drier F deck, working by lamplight as the ship's power flickered uncertainly. What many don't realize is that these weren't just letters and packages. The mail carried irreplaceable documents, business contracts, immigration papers, and personal correspondence that represented lifelines for families separated by the Atlantic. The postal workers understood that each sack contained someone's hope, someone's future, and someone's connection to loved ones across the ocean. As the water continued to rise, the 5 men worked with methodical precision. They had trained for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of a sinking ship. The mailroom's location near the front of the vessel meant they were among the first to experience the full force of the flooding. Yet witness accounts from survivors indicate they continued working even as water reached their waists. John March, the chief postal clerk, had sailed on numerous Atlantic crossings and was respected by crew members for his calm demeanour under pressure. That night, he guided his team with the unwavering professionalism that characterised his entire career. The men worked in assembly line fashion, passing sacks from hand to hand, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as the water level rose. By midnight, the situation had become desperate. The postal workers had managed to relocate hundreds of mail sacks to higher decks, but the flooding was accelerating. The mailroom's electric lights had failed, leaving them to work by the dim glow of emergency lighting. Still, they persisted, driven by a sense of duty that transcended personal safety. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the water had risen to chest level in the mailroom. Despite acknowledging the loss of their battle, the 5 men remained unwavering in their dedication. Instead of immediately seeking lifeboats, they made one final effort to secure what mail they could in waterproof containers, hoping that some might survive even if they did not. The last confirmed sighting of the postal workers came at 1:30 a.m., just over an hour before the ship's final plunge. A surviving crew member reported seeing them still working on F-deck, now waist-deep in water, methodically securing mail sacks with rope and canvas. Their faces, illuminated by flickering emergency lights, showed exhaustion but not defeat. None of the 5 postal workers survived the disaster. Their bodies were never recovered, claimed by the same Atlantic waters that swallowed their carefully tended mail. However, their sacrifice wasn't entirely in vain. Several mail sacks were found floating in the debris field and were later recovered by rescue ships. Some letters, sealed in waterproof pouches, reached their intended recipients weeks later, bearing water stains that told their story of that terrible night. The postal workers' dedication became a symbol of professional honour and personal sacrifice. In an era when mail service was the primary means of long-distance communication, these 5 men understood that their work connected families, enabled commerce, and maintained the bonds that held communities together across vast distances. Their decision to prioritise duty over personal safety reflected values that defined their generation, values that would be tested again and again in the turbulent decades that followed. The story of the Titanic's band has been told countless times, but the deeper narrative of how music functioned as both comfort and communication during the disaster reveals layers of human psychology often overlooked. The 8 musicians aboard the ship, led by band leader Wallace Hartley, represented more than entertainment. They embodied the sophisticated cultural aspirations of Edwardian society and the belief that civilization could triumph over chaos through art and refinement. Wallace Hartley, a 33-year-old from Yorkshire, had assembled his ensemble with meticulous care. Each musician brought unique skills and backgrounds that reflected the international nature of the ship's passenger list. The band included violinists, cellists and pianists who had performed in some of Europe's finest hotels and concert halls. They weren't merely ship's entertainers, but accomplished artists who had chosen maritime work for its steady income and opportunities to travel. What made their final performance extraordinary wasn't just their decision to keep playing, but their sophisticated understanding of music's psychological impact. As the ship listed and panic spread, Hartley made calculated choices about repertoire. The band initially played upbeat ragtime numbers and popular songs to maintain normalcy and prevent mass hysteria. They understood that familiar melodies could provide psychological anchors in a situation where reality had become incomprehensible. The musicians positioned themselves strategically on the boat deck, where their music could reach the maximum number of passengers. Their location wasn't accidental. Hartley had studied the ship's acoustics during the voyage and knew exactly where sound would carry most effectively. As lifeboats were lowered, the band's music provided a sonic backdrop that helped maintain order during the evacuation process. Survivor testimonies reveal that the band's music evolved throughout the night, reflecting the changing psychology of the disaster. As the situation became increasingly desperate, Hartley transitioned from popular entertainment to hymns and classical pieces. This shift wasn't random. but represented a deliberate attempt to provide spiritual comfort as hope for survival diminished. The choice of "Nearer, my God, to Thee" as their final selection has been debated for over a century, but multiple survivors confirmed hearing hymns during the ship's final minutes. What's remarkable is that the musicians continued playing even as the deck tilted at increasingly severe angles, making it physically difficult to maintain their instruments and their balance. Their commitment transcended mere professionalism. It became an act of defiance against the chaos surrounding them. The band's performance also served a practical purpose that historians often overlook. Their music masked the sounds of the ship's death throes, the groaning of metal, the rushing of water, and the mechanical failures that accompanied the sinking. By providing an alternative auditory focus, they helped prevent the complete psychological breakdown that might have occurred if passengers had been forced to listen only to the ship's destruction. Each musician made a personal choice to remain with the band rather than seek survival. Roger Brousseau, the young French cellist, had written to his family about his excitement for the voyage. Percy Taylor, the pianist, had planned to marry his fiancée upon returning to London. These men sacrificed their individual futures for what they perceived as a greater good, the maintenance of human dignity in the face of catastrophe. The musicians' dedication influenced other crew members and passengers. Their example of selfless service inspired acts of heroism throughout the ship. Stewards continued serving passengers, engineers remained at their posts to maintain power, and wireless operators stayed at their equipment sending distress signals. The band's music became the soundtrack for countless individual acts of courage and sacrifice. The cultural impact of the musicians' final performance extended far beyond the disaster itself. Their story became a template for how artists should respond to crisis, not by seeking personal safety, but by using their talents to serve others. This narrative resonated particularly strongly in the years following the disaster, as Europe moved toward World War I and society grappled with questions about individual responsibility and collective sacrifice. The band's instruments, lost with the ship, became symbols of artistic dedication. Music halls and concert venues across Britain and America held memorial concerts, with orchestras playing the same pieces that had echoed across the North Atlantic on that April night. Their sacrifice transformed music from entertainment into a form of moral witness, demonstrating art's power to provide meaning and comfort even in humanity's darkest hours. 20 miles away from the dying Titanic, the cargo ship SS Californian sat motionless in the ice field, her engines stopped for the night. Captain Stanley Lord had made the prudent decision to halt his vessel until daylight, avoiding the dangerous ice that had claimed the supposedly unsinkable ship. What transpired aboard the Californian during the next several hours would become one of maritime history's most contentious debates, raising questions about moral responsibility, professional duty, and the weight of decisions made in uncertainty. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had shut down his radio equipment at 11:30 p.m., just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. This timing wasn't coincidental. Evans had worked a long day and followed standard procedures for merchant vessels, which typically didn't maintain 24-hour radio watches. The economic realities of shipping meant that most vessels carried only one wireless operator, making continuous communication impossible. What the Californian's crew did see were mysterious lights and rockets in the distance. Third Officer Charles Groves first spotted a large steamer approaching around 11 p.m., describing it as a passenger vessel with multiple rows of lights. The ship appeared to be moving slowly, then seemed to stop. Crew members reported seeing white rockets fired from the distant vessel throughout the night. Captain Lord's response to these sightings reveals the complexity of maritime decision-making in an era before modern communication. When informed about the rockets, he inquired whether they were company signals, coloured flares used by shipping lines to communicate with their vessels. White rockets, while typically distress signals, could also be used for other purposes. Lord's caution reflected both professional conservatism and the practical realities of command in dangerous waters. The Californian's crew continued watching the mysterious vessel throughout the night. Second Officer Herbert Stone observed approximately 8 rockets fired at intervals, noting that the ship appeared to be moving away and eventually disappeared. Stone reported these observations to Captain Lord, who was resting in the chart room. The captain's responses, asking about the colour of the rockets and instructing the crew to continue monitoring, suggest a commander wrestling with incomplete information and multiple possible interpretations. The Californians' tragedy is the gap between what the crew saw and what they understood, not malice. The ship's officers were experienced mariners who had spent their careers in merchant service, where distress situations were relatively rare. Their training and experience didn't prepare them for the possibility that they were witnessing the death of 1,500 people just beyond the horizon. Captain Lord's decision to remain stationary became the focus of intense scrutiny during the British Board of Trade inquiry. Lord maintained that his ship was too far away to reach the Titanic in time, and that the vessel his crew observed was not the White Star liner, but another ship entirely. This position wasn't entirely implausible. The ice field contained multiple vessels that night, and visual identification across 20 miles of dark water presented significant challenges. The inquiry's criticism of Captain Lord reflected broader questions about professional responsibility and moral duty. Should a ship's captain risk his vessel and crew based on ambiguous signals? How much certainty is required before taking potentially dangerous action? These questions extended beyond maritime law into fundamental issues of human responsibility and the obligations we have to strangers in distress. The Californian controversy also highlighted the technological limitations of the era. The ship carried wireless equipment, but operated it intermittently. Navigation relied on dead reckoning and celestial observation. Communication between vessels depended on visual signals, flags, and Morse lamps. In this context, the failure to respond to the Titanic's distress calls wasn't necessarily negligence, but rather a consequence of technological and organizational limitations. The debate over the Californians' actions continued for decades, dividing maritime experts and historians. Some argued that Captain Lord was a scapegoat for systemic failures in maritime safety. Others maintained that his inaction represented a fundamental failure of moral courage. The controversy reflected deeper cultural tensions about individual responsibility versus institutional accountability. The case influenced maritime law and practices for generations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, adopted in 1914, mandated continuous radio watches on passenger vessels. The Californian incident became a case study in maritime academies, teaching future officers about the weight of command decisions and the importance of acting on incomplete information when lives might be at stake. Captain Lord's reputation never fully recovered from the inquiry's findings. He spent the remainder of his career defending his actions, arguing that he had followed proper procedures and made reasonable decisions based on available information. His supporters maintained that he became a scapegoat for broader failures in maritime safety regulation and ship design that had made the Titanic disaster possible. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's chief designer, walked through his creation's tilting corridors with the methodical precision of a man conducting his autopsy. At 39 years old, Andrews represented the pinnacle of naval architecture, a profession that combined artistic vision with mathematical precision. His presence aboard the ship during its maiden voyage wasn't ceremonial, but reflected his deep personal investment in every rivet, every bulkhead, and every design decision that had transformed blueprints into the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Andrews had spent 3 years perfecting the Titanic's design, working from his offices at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. His approach to ship design was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing not just size and luxury but also safety features that went beyond regulatory requirements. The ship's watertight compartments, double hull, and advanced pumping systems represented the most sophisticated maritime safety technology available in 1912. The designer's confidence in his creation wasn't mere arrogance, but reflected genuine technological achievement. The Titanic incorporated innovations that would influence ship design for decades: electric lighting throughout the vessel, advanced ventilation systems, and structural engineering that distributed weight more effectively than any previous ship. Andrews had studied every maritime disaster of the previous century, incorporating lessons learned into his design. When the collision occurred, Andrews immediately understood what others couldn't accept. His ship was doomed. His intimate knowledge of the vessel's construction allowed him to calculate the flooding rate and recognize that the damage exceeded the ship's survivability threshold. The iceberg had breached 5 compartments, while the ship could survive flooding in only 4. Such an event wasn't a failure of design, but rather an impact that exceeded the disaster scenarios Andrews had planned for. The designer's actions during the ship's final hours revealed both his technical expertise and his moral character. He moved through the vessel with a blueprint in his mind, directing passengers towards safety and advising crew members on the ship's condition. His presence provided crucial technical guidance during the evacuation, helping officers understand which areas would flood first and which routes would remain passable longest. Andrew's relationship with the ship transcended professional duty. He had overseen every aspect of construction, from the selection of steel to the positioning of lifeboats. The vessel represented not just his career achievement, but also his vision of how technology could enhance human experience. The ship's grand staircase, luxurious staterooms, and innovative amenities reflected his belief that engineering should serve beauty as well as function. The tragic irony of Andrew's situation was that his design had actually performed better than regulations required. The ship's watertight compartments had functioned correctly, slowing the flooding and providing crucial time for evacuation. The electrical systems had maintained power longer than expected, keeping lights functioning and wireless equipment operational. The ship's structural integrity had held long enough to allow the launching of lifeboats. Despite damage that would have sunk lesser vessels immediately, Andrew's final hours demonstrated the complex relationship between engineering confidence and human fallibility. His design had accounted for collision scenarios, fire dangers, and mechanical failures, but the specific nature of the iceberg impact, a glancing blow that opened multiple compartments simultaneously, represented a catastrophic failure mode that existing technology couldn't address. The disaster revealed the limitations of engineering hubris while simultaneously showcasing the designer's technical competence. The designer's presence aboard the ship during its maiden voyage reflected standard practice for significant vessels. Naval architects often sailed on initial crossings to observe their creations under operational conditions, making notes for future improvements. Andrews had planned to document the ship's performance, gathering data that would influence the design of the third Olympic-class vessel, the Britannic. His death represented not just personal tragedy, but the loss of invaluable technical knowledge. Andrews possessed a detailed understanding of the ship's construction, knowledge that died with him. His notes and observations about the vessel's performance during the disaster could have been vital to future ship design, but these insights were lost when he chose to remain aboard rather than seek survival. The designer's legacy extended far beyond the Titanic disaster. His innovations in ship construction influenced maritime design for decades, contributing to safer and more efficient vessels. The lessons learned from the Titanic's sinking, combined with Andrews' previous design work, helped establish new standards for maritime safety that prevented similar disasters. Andrews' story exemplifies the moral complexity of technological disaster. His design wasn't flawed, but rather faced circumstances that exceeded its intended parameters. The tragedy wasn't that he created an unsafe ship, but that he had created a vessel that, while revolutionary for its time, couldn't survive an impact that no ship of that era could have withstood. His death represented not the failure of engineering, but the limitations of human foresight in the face of unpredictable catastrophe. In the Titanic's Marconi room, 2 men worked frantically at equipment that represented the cutting edge of early 20th century communication technology. Jack Phillips, 25, and Harold Bride, 22, were part of an elite group of wireless operators who had mastered the complex art of Morse code transmission across vast oceanic distances. Their work that night would demonstrate both the revolutionary potential and the crucial limitations of wireless communication in its infancy. The Marconi system aboard the Titanic marked a significant advancement in maritime communication. Previous generations of ships had relied on visual signals, flags, and signal lamps, methods that worked only in clear weather and daylight hours. Wireless telegraphy promised to connect ships with shore stations and other vessels regardless of weather conditions or time of day. For the first time in maritime history, A ship in distress could summon help from hundreds of miles away. Phillips, the senior operator, had spent the day before the collision working through a massive backlog of passenger messages. The ship's wealthy passengers had discovered the novelty of sending wireless messages from mid-ocean, creating unprecedented demand for communication services. These personal messages, business correspondence, social notes, and family communications took priority over routine ship-to-ship traffic, a decision that would later prove controversial. The wireless operators worked in shifts, but the equipment required constant maintenance and adjustment. The Marconi transmitter was temperamental, requiring skilled operators who could troubleshoot technical problems while maintaining communication schedules. The apparatus filled a small room with complex machinery, including spark gap transmitters, receivers, and the emergency backup equipment that would prove crucial during the disaster. When the collision occurred, Phillips immediately began transmitting the international distress signal, CQD, a call that meant all stations distress. The signal was relatively new, having been adopted only 6 years earlier as ships began carrying wireless equipment. Phillips alternated between CQD and the newer SOS signal, trying to reach any ship within wireless range of the Titanic's powerful transmitter. The initial response to the distress calls was frustratingly slow. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, responded first, but her wireless operator had been about to shut down for the night. Other ships were either too far away or had already closed their wireless rooms. The Frankfurt, a German vessel, responded, but was over 150 miles distant. The technological limitation of wireless communication meant that help, while theoretically available, remained practically out of reach. Phillips' transmission technique revealed both his skill and the limitations of early wireless equipment. He had to manually adjust the transmitter's power and frequency while simultaneously operating the Morse key. The ship's electrical system, damaged by the collision, provided inconsistent power that affected transmission quality. Despite these challenges, Phillips maintained almost continuous communication with shore stations and other vessels. Harold Bride, the junior operator, worked to maintain the backup equipment and assist with message transmission. His role became increasingly crucial as the main transmitter began failing. The two men worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that their ability to communicate the ship's position and condition would determine whether rescue vessels could reach survivors in time. The wireless operator's work that night demonstrated the international nature of maritime communication. They communicated with German, British, and American vessels, coordinating rescue efforts across national boundaries. Coastal stations relayed their messages to shipping companies and government agencies, establishing a communication network spanning the Atlantic Ocean. As the ship's electrical power failed, the wireless operators switched to emergency batteries, maintaining transmission capability even as the vessel listed severely. Their dedication to maintaining communication continued until the very end. Phillips was last seen at his equipment, sending distress signals even as water flooded the wireless room. His commitment to duty ensured that rescue vessels had accurate information about the disaster's location and the number of survivors. The wireless operators' heroism extended beyond their technical skills to their decision-making under extreme pressure. They prioritized distress signals over personal safety, recognizing that their ability to communicate with potential rescue vessels represented the difference between life and death for hundreds of survivors. Their actions demonstrated how technology could amplify human courage and determination. Bride's survival provided crucial testimony about the disaster's final hours. His account of the wireless room's operations, the sequence of distress calls, and the responses from other vessels became essential evidence in subsequent investigations. His testimony helped establish the timeline of events and identified both the heroes and the failures in the maritime communication system. The wireless operator's story illustrated the paradox of technological progress, advanced communication systems that could reach across thousands of miles, but remained dependent on human operators who worked limited hours and followed commercial rather than safety priorities. Their heroism highlighted both the potential and the limitations of early 20th century technology, foreshadowing the communication systems that would eventually make such disasters impossible. In the depths of the Titanic's third-class compartments, hundreds of immigrants carried more than just luggage. They transported dreams, hopes, and the accumulated savings of entire families. who had invested everything in passage to America. These passengers, often overlooked in accounts that focus on wealthy first-class victims, represented the human tide of early 20th century immigration that would reshape American society. Their stories reveal the complex motivations, expectations, and tragedies that defined the immigrant experience. The ship's third-class accommodations, while basic by the standards of first-class luxury, represented significant improvements over typical steerage conditions. The White Star Line had designed these spaces to attract immigrants willing to pay premium prices for better treatment during the Atlantic crossing. Private cabins, electric lighting, and improved ventilation systems made the Titanic's third-class passage more comfortable than the crowded dormitories common on other vessels. Among the third-class passengers were families who had sold farms, businesses, and family possessions to finance their journey. The Sage family from England travelled with 11 members, including 9 children, seeking agricultural opportunities in the American West. Their decision to emigrate reflected not desperation but calculated optimism about America's expanding economy and the opportunities it offered for skilled workers and entrepreneurs. The linguistic diversity of third-class passengers created a complex social dynamic aboard the ship. Italian stonemasons, Swedish farmers, Irish labourers, and Lebanese merchants shared dining rooms and social spaces, creating temporary communities that bridged cultural and national boundaries. These interactions provided glimpses of the multicultural society that America was becoming, as immigrants learned to navigate cultural differences while maintaining their distinct identities. Many third-class passengers carried documents that represented their life's achievements, apprenticeship certificates, letters of recommendation, and family records that would establish their credibility in America. These papers, carefully preserved through the Atlantic crossing, would have enabled immigrants to find employment and establish themselves in their new country. The loss of these documents in the disaster represented not just personal tragedy, but the erasure of human capital that could have contributed to American economic development. The social dynamics of third-class passengers during the disaster revealed both the limitations and the humanity of early 20th century social hierarchies. While barriers existed between passenger classes, emergency conditions broke down some of these distinctions. Crew members directed third-class passengers toward lifeboats, and some survived alongside wealthy first-class passengers. However, the ship's design and evacuation procedures still reflected class-based assumptions about passenger priority. The immigrants' responses to the disaster varied based on their cultural backgrounds and previous experiences. Scandinavian passengers, familiar with maritime travel, often understood the gravity of the situation more quickly than those from landlocked regions. Italian and Lebanese passengers, accustomed to extended family networks, often stayed together as groups, sometimes hindering evacuation efforts but providing emotional support during the crisis. The economic impact of the disaster on immigrant communities extended far beyond the immediate victims. Relatives already in America had sponsored many passengers, providing passage money and guaranteeing employment. The loss of these immigrants disrupted carefully planned family reunifications and economic strategies that had taken years to develop. Entire communities in America mourned relatives they had never met, but had eagerly anticipated welcoming. The survival stories of third-class passengers often demonstrated resourcefulness and determination that reflected their immigrant experience. These were people accustomed to overcoming obstacles, navigating bureaucratic systems, and adapting to unfamiliar environments. Their ability to survive the disaster often depended on skills they had developed during their journey to America: language abilities, cultural adaptability, and the capacity to make quick decisions under pressure. The tragedy also revealed the vulnerability of immigrant communities to disasters that affected transportation systems. Unlike wealthy passengers who could afford multiple attempts at ocean crossing, many third-class passengers had invested their life savings in a single journey. The disaster's impact on these families was therefore catastrophic, eliminating not just lives, but the economic foundations that had made immigration possible. The cultural memory of the disaster varied significantly among different immigrant communities. Italian Americans, Scandinavian Americans, and other ethnic groups created their own narratives about the tragedy, often emphasizing the courage and sacrifice of their compatriots. These stories became part of the broader immigrant experience, demonstrating how newcomers to America had faced and overcome extraordinary challenges. The loss of third-class passengers represented more than individual tragedy. It symbolized the interruption of America's great immigration wave. Each victim had represented potential contributions to American society, skilled craftsmen, ambitious entrepreneurs, and young families who would have strengthened the nation's economic and cultural foundation. Their deaths reminded the world that the promise of America remained vulnerable to the same natural and technological forces that affected all humanity. The RMS Carpathia, sailing from New York to the Mediterranean, received the Titanic's distress signal at 12:35 a.m. on April 15, 1912. Captain Arthur Rostron's immediate response would transform him from an obscure merchant captain into a maritime hero, demonstrating how individual leadership can triumph over impossible circumstances. His ship's race through the ice fields to reach the disaster site became one of the most dramatic rescue operations in maritime history. Captain Rostron faced an extraordinary challenge when wireless operator Harold Cottam brought him the Titanic's distress message. The Carpathia was 58 miles away, travelling at her normal speed of 14 knots. To reach the disaster site before survivors succumbed to hypothermia, Rostron would need to push his ship beyond its design limits, while navigating the same ice field that had destroyed the unsinkable Titanic. His decision to attempt the rescue required both technical expertise and moral courage. The Carpathia's crew responded to Rostron's emergency orders with remarkable efficiency. Engineers pushed the ship's engines to 17 knots, a speed that strained every component of the vessel's propulsion system. Additional stokers fed the furnaces, creating steam pressure that exceeded normal operating parameters. The ship's medical staff prepared for mass casualties, setting up treatment areas and gathering supplies for hundreds of potential survivors. Rostron's navigation through the ice field demonstrated masterful seamanship. He positioned extra lookouts, increased lighting, and personally directed the ship's course through waters that had claimed the world's largest passenger vessel just hours earlier. The captain's ability to maintain maximum speed while avoiding ice required constant adjustments and split-second decisions that could have resulted in a second maritime disaster. The Carpathia's wireless operator maintained continuous communication with other vessels, coordinating rescue efforts and providing updates on the ship's progress. This communication network enabled other vessels to adjust their courses and assist in the rescue operation. The Frankfurt, Olympic and other ships altered their routes to provide backup assistance, creating an impromptu maritime rescue fleet. When the Carpathia reached the disaster site at 3:30 a.m., the crew faced the horrifying reality of the Atlantic's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster. The ship's crew had prepared for hundreds of survivors, but they found only 705 people in 20 lifeboats scattered across miles of debris-filled ocean. The water temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit had killed most of those who had entered the water, leaving floating corpses and debris as the only evidence of the Titanic's 2,224 passengers and crew. The rescue operation required precise coordination and emotional strength. Carpathia's crew lowered rope ladders and rigged pulley systems to bring survivors aboard. Many passengers were suffering from hypothermia and required immediate medical attention. Overwhelming the ship's limited medical facilities, crew members prioritized providing basic care to the most seriously injured survivors. The Carpathia's passengers, originally bound for Mediterranean vacations, immediately opened their cabins and personal belongings to Titanic survivors. This spontaneous generosity demonstrated the human capacity for compassion during crisis. Passengers shared clothing, food and personal items with survivors who had lost everything. The ship's dining rooms became refugee centres, providing warmth and comfort to people who had experienced unimaginable trauma. Captain Rostron's decisions during the rescue operation revealed both his humanitarian instincts and his practical understanding of maritime law. He ordered the recovery of bodies floating in the water, recognizing the importance of providing closure to families and gathering evidence for future investigations. The ship's crew also collected debris that might provide clues about the disaster's cause, preserving evidence that would prove crucial in subsequent inquiries. The return journey to New York became a period of mourning and reflection. Survivors began processing their experiences, sharing stories that would become the foundation of historical accounts. The ship's wireless operator worked continuously, sending survivor lists to anxious relatives and providing updates to news organizations. These communications created the first detailed accounts of the disaster, shaping public understanding of the tragedy. The Carpathia's arrival in New York Harbor on April 18th marked the beginning of the disaster's aftermath. Thousands of people gathered at the docks, seeking information about relatives and friends. The ship's passengers and crew had become unwilling participants in one of history's most significant news events, their actions scrutinized by investigators, journalists, and the public. The rescue operation's success resulted from the convergence of individual heroism, technological capability, and maritime tradition. Captain Rostron's leadership, his crew's dedication, and the ship's mechanical reliability enabled the rescue of 705 survivors who would have died without intervention. Their actions demonstrated the triumph of human courage and technical competence over natural forces, even in the face of unprecedented disaster. The Carpathia's role in the Titanic rescue became a template for maritime emergency response. The ship's crew had improvised solutions to unprecedented challenges, creating procedures that would influence rescue operations for decades. Their experience demonstrated the importance of preparation, leadership, and international cooperation in responding to maritime disasters. The rescue operation's psychological impact on the Carpathia's crew and passengers extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Many participants in the rescue suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, haunted by the scenes of death and suffering they had witnessed. Their sacrifice, the interruption of their journeys to save strangers, exemplified the maritime tradition of mutual assistance that remains fundamental to ocean travel. The story of the Carpathia's rescue mission ultimately became a testament to human resilience and the power of individual action in the face of catastrophe. Captain Rostron's decision to risk his ship and crew to save Titanic survivors demonstrated that heroes emerge not from extraordinary circumstances, but from ordinary people who choose to act with courage when confronted with human suffering. The telephone rang at 3:47 a.m. in the cramped office of the Sverdlovsk Search and Rescue Headquarters. Captain Mikhail Potapov had been expecting this call for 3 days, though he'd hoped it would never come. The voice on the other end belonged to Yuri Blinov, university administrator and father figure to the missing expedition group. They should have sent word by now. Blinov's voice carried the particular strain of someone who'd been awake for days. The telegram was supposed to arrive yesterday at the latest. Potapov knew the statistics. In the Ural Mountains, when experienced hikers missed their check-in by more than 24 hours during winter, the survival rate dropped to numbers no one spoke aloud. But these weren't ordinary hikers. Igor Dyatlov's group represented the finest outdoor enthusiasts the Ural Polytechnic Institute had produced. 9 students and 1 graduate, all seasoned mountaineers with collective decades of winter experience. The expedition had departed on January 23, 1959, bound for Otorten Mountain. Their planned route would take them through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the northern Urals, but for this group it represented an achievable challenge rather than a death wish. They'd meticulously planned every detail, from food rations calculated to the gram to backup equipment stored in waterproof containers. As Potapov assembled his search team, he reviewed the expedition's roster. Igor Dyatlov, 23, the group's leader and an engineering student whose previous expeditions had become legendary among his peers. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, one of the few women brave enough to attempt winter mountaineering in an era when such pursuits were considered masculine domains. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a meteorology student whose understanding of weather patterns had saved multiple expeditions from disaster. The list continued with names that would soon become etched in mystery. Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenko, Yuri Yudin, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Lyudmila Dubinina. Each possessed specialized skills that made them invaluable team members. Yudin, however, had turned back early due to illness, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When the search party finally reached the abandoned truck that had transported the group to their starting point, they found it exactly as expected, properly secured, with extra supplies stored inside. The real investigation began when they discovered the tent on the slopes of Kholat Shachel, a mountain whose Mansi name translated to Dead Mountain. The scene defied every principle of wilderness survival Potapov had learned in his 15 years of mountain rescue. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not torn by wind or damaged by external forces. The cuts were deliberate and methodical, made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Yet the pattern made no sense. Why would experienced mountaineers destroy their only shelter during a blizzard? More disturbing were the footprints leading away from the tent. 9 sets of tracks, some barefoot, others in socks or single boots, headed down the slope toward the tree line. These weren't the panicked, scattered tracks of people fleeing in terror. They moved in a roughly organised formation, suggesting the group had evacuated together with some degree of coordination. The temperature that night had plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Even with proper cold weather gear, survival time in such conditions is measured in minutes, not hours. Yet the footprints indicated the group had walked nearly a mile from their shelter, down an exposed slope that offered no protection from the wind. As the search team followed the tracks, they discovered something that would become one of the incident's most puzzling aspects: personal belongings scattered along the route. The personal belongings were not dropped randomly, but were placed with apparent deliberation. Someone had left a flashlight on, and it was still in working order. Despite the apparent urgency of the situation, a piece of clothing lay there, folded. The first bodies were found near the tree line, beneath a large cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko lay side by side, dressed only in underwear despite the deadly cold. Their hands showed signs of desperate climbing attempts on the cedar's trunk, with bark embedded under their fingernails and skin scraped raw. Someone had built a fire nearby, evidenced by the charred branches and ash circle, but it had been insufficient to sustain life in such extreme conditions. The scene suggested a group that had fled their shelter in extreme haste, yet had somehow maintained enough composure to attempt survival strategies. This contradiction would become the foundation of countless theories, each attempting to explain how rational, experienced mountaineers could make such seemingly irrational decisions. 3 more bodies were discovered along the route back toward the tent, as if they had attempted to return to their shelter, but succumbed to the cold. Igor Dyatlov himself was found 300 meters from the cedar tree, his body positioned as though he had been crawling uphill. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found further along, and Rustem Slobodin was closest to the tent, just 480 meters from their abandoned shelter. Exposure and hypothermia could potentially explain these 5 tragic deaths. The true mystery pertained to the remaining 4 team members, whose bodies remained undiscovered for an additional 2 months. When they were finally discovered in a snow-covered ravine, the investigation would take a turn that transformed a wilderness tragedy into one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. The spring thaw of 1959 arrived later than usual in the northern Urals, extending the search for the remaining 4 expedition members well into May. Search teams had combed every likely location, following protocols developed over decades of mountain rescue operations, yet the bodies of Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Lyudmila Dubinina, and Yuri Yudin seemed to have vanished into the mountain itself. Senior investigator Lev Ivanov had taken personal charge of the case, recognizing that the incident had implications far beyond a simple mountaineering accident. The Soviet system demanded explanations, particularly when 9 of the country's brightest young minds had died under mysterious circumstances. The families deserved answers, and the mountaineering community needed to understand what had gone wrong to prevent future tragedies. The breakthrough came on May 4th, when a search team discovered a section of snow that had settled differently than the surrounding area. Beneath this depression, they found what appeared to be a makeshift shelter, branches and clothing arranged in a pattern that suggested the missing 4 had survived the initial evacuation from their tent and had attempted to create a more permanent refuge. But when the bodies were finally excavated, the mystery deepened exponentially. These 4 individuals had not died from exposure like their companions. They had suffered massive internal injuries that defied explanation. Thibaut Brignol's skull had been fractured with such force that brain tissue had been displaced. Dubonina's ribs were broken, and her heart had been crushed. Kolevatov showed similar internal damage, as if all 3 had been subjected to tremendous pressure from an external force. The medical examiner's report would become one of the most controversial documents in Soviet investigative history. Dr. Boris Vozrozhdeny, a pathologist with 30 years of experience, stated that the injuries were consistent with massive trauma, as if they had been hit by a car or caught in a shockwave. Yet there were no external wounds, no cuts or bruises that would typically accompany such severe internal damage. Most disturbing of all was the condition of Lyudmila Dubonina's body. Her tongue and eyes were missing, along with significant portions of soft tissue around her face. Initially attributed to natural decomposition and animal activity, the pattern of tissue loss troubled investigators. The damage appeared too selective, too precise for scavenging animals, who typically follow predictable feeding patterns. The clothing analysis provided additional puzzles. Several garments showed elevated levels of radioactivity, detected by instruments that Soviet authorities rarely deployed for wilderness investigations. The contamination wasn't uniform. It appeared concentrated on specific pieces of clothing, as if the individuals had been exposed to a radioactive source during their final hours. Yuri Yudin, the expedition member who had turned back due to illness, would spend the rest of his life studying photographs and evidence from the scene. In later interviews, he noted details that official reports had overlooked. The tent's damage pattern, he insisted, showed 2 distinct types of cuts, some made hastily from inside by people in extreme distress, others made with more precision, possibly by someone with access to better tools. The footprint analysis revealed another troubling detail. While 9 sets of tracks led away from the tent, the pattern wasn't consistent with a panicked evacuation. The spacing between footprints suggested a walking pace, not running. Some tracks showed evidence of individuals stopping, turning around, and continuing in the same direction. This behavior pattern didn't match any known psychological response to immediate danger. Local Mansi hunters, when finally interviewed, provided information that investigators initially dismissed, but would later consider crucial. They reported unusual lights in the sky during the time period when the expedition would have been setting up camp. These weren't aurora borealis, which were common in the region, but focused moving lights that appeared to originate from a specific location, rather than the broad atmospheric displays typical of natural phenomena. The Mansi also mentioned finding animal tracks that stopped abruptly in the snow, as if wildlife had fled the area suddenly. This detail gained significance when investigators realized that the search teams had found no animal remains or tracks in the immediate vicinity of the tent, unusual for an area that typically supported diverse winter wildlife. As the investigation progressed, Ivanov began documenting details that weren't making their way into official reports. Military personnel had been present during several phases of the search, offering technical assistance that seemed to focus more on removing evidence than preserving it. Certain photographs had been confiscated, and witnesses had been advised to limit their discussions of what they had observed. The tent itself had been removed from the scene and transported to a secure facility, where it remained for examination by specialists whose credentials were never disclosed. When it was finally returned to the investigation, several pieces of fabric had been removed for testing purposes. These samples were never mentioned in subsequent reports, and requests for their return or analysis results were met with administrative delays. The most troubling aspect of the evidence chain was the gap between the discovery of the first 5 bodies and the location of the remaining 4. 2 months had passed, during which the investigation had supposedly been thorough and comprehensive. Yet the 4 bodies in the ravine had been located in an area that search teams claimed to have examined multiple times. Either the initial searches had been remarkably incompetent, or the bodies had been placed in the ravine after the area had been cleared. The official cause of death for the ravine victims was listed as compelling natural force, a phrase that satisfied no one and explained nothing. This bureaucratic language would become emblematic of the entire investigation, technically accurate but deliberately vague, creating more questions than answers. As summer approached and the case moved toward official closure, Ivanov found himself under increasing pressure to produce a conclusion that would satisfy his superiors while providing closure to the families. The solution he would ultimately propose would be both groundbreaking and career-ending, representing one of the most unusual official explanations in Soviet investigative history. Lev Ivanov had built his reputation on methodical investigation and logical conclusions. In 23 years of criminal investigation, he'd never encountered evidence that refused to conform to rational explanation. The Dyatlov Pass incident was reshaping his understanding of what constituted acceptable evidence and reasonable doubt. The pressure from his superiors intensified as summer progressed. The families of the deceased had become increasingly vocal in their demands for answers. The international mountaineering community had begun asking questions that Moscow preferred not to address. Most significantly, the incident had attracted attention from foreign journalists, who were beginning to inquire about Soviet wilderness safety protocols. Decades later, Ivanov's private notes surfaced, revealing the depth of his frustration. He documented numerous anomalies that contradicted the official narrative of a mountaineering accident. The radiation readings, the unusual injury patterns, the selective tissue damage, the military presence during the investigation. Each element suggested a complex incident that extended far beyond equipment failure or weather-related deaths. The breakthrough in his thinking came during a conversation with Dr. Vozrojdeny, the pathologist who'd examined the ravine victims. Over vodka in the doctor's kitchen, away from official recording devices, Vozrojdeny shared observations that hadn't appeared in his written reports. He explained that the damage to the rib cage was not consistent with falling or hitting rocks. The fracture patterns indicated a simultaneous application of uniform pressure throughout the entire chest cavity. I've seen similar injuries in aircraft accident victims, but only when they've been subjected to extreme changes in air pressure. Vozrojdeny continued with even more disturbing details. Neither animals nor decomposition had removed the missing soft tissues from Dubinina's face. The edges of the damage were too clean, too precise. Something had selectively removed specific tissues while leaving others intact. In 30 years of pathology, he said, I've never seen animal predation that targets only the mouth and eye area, while leaving more accessible tissue untouched. Whatever removed those tissues had a specific purpose. In the meantime, Ivanov was receiving reports from the search teams, which were not part of the official documentation. During the rescue operation, multiple witnesses reported observing unusual aerial phenomena. These weren't casual glimpses of distant objects, but prolonged observations of structured lights that moved in patterns inconsistent with natural phenomena or known aircraft. Sergeant Vladimir Ashkenazy, who'd led several search teams, provided the most detailed account. On the night of February 17th, while searching for the remaining 4 bodies, his team had observed a bright orange sphere moving slowly across the sky. The object had maintained a consistent altitude and speed for approximately 15 minutes before suddenly accelerating and disappearing beyond the horizon. It wasn't a flare or aircraft navigation light, Ashkenazy insisted. The colour was unlike anything in our standard equipment inventory, and the movement pattern was too controlled to be natural phenomena. Other team members corroborated similar observations on different nights. The consistency of these reports troubled Ivanov, particularly when combined with the Mansi hunters' accounts of unusual lights in the area during the time when the expedition would have been active. The military's involvement in the investigation had become increasingly intrusive. Colonel Georgy Ortyukov, ostensibly present to provide logistical support, had begun directing certain aspects of the evidence collection. Specific items were being removed from the scene for specialized analysis at facilities that Ivanov couldn't identify or access. Upon Ivanov's request for information about these analyses, he received a response that classified such details for national security reasons. This response transformed his investigation from a criminal case into something approaching a state secret, with implications that extended far beyond the deaths of 9 mountaineers. The final setback occurred when Ivanov received instructions to prepare his closing report without access to several crucial pieces of evidence: the tent fabric samples, the clothing with elevated radiation readings, and the photographs showing the unusual light phenomena had all been classified and removed from his case files. Faced with an impossible situation, Ivanov made a decision that would define the remainder of his career. He would include in his official report a conclusion that acknowledged the evidence while avoiding details that might compromise state security. His solution was both brilliant and professionally suicidal. Ivanov, in his final report, attributed the deaths to a compelling natural force that the investigation was unable to definitively identify. He specifically noted the presence of unusual phenomena in the area during the relevant time, including light anomalies that had been observed by multiple witnesses. Most significantly, he recommended that the area be designated as off-limits for expeditions for the next 3 years, citing factors beyond current understanding that posed risks to civilian safety. This recommendation would effectively acknowledge that the entity responsible for the deaths of the Dyatlov group might still be active in the region. The reaction to Ivanov's report was swift and severe. He was immediately removed from the case and reassigned to administrative duties. His recommendation for area closure was implemented without public explanation, fueling speculation that would persist for decades. In private conversations with colleagues, Ivanov would later admit that his investigation had uncovered evidence of phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of atmospheric and physical sciences. He'd documented cases where natural laws appeared to have been suspended or altered, creating conditions that could explain the expedition's bizarre behaviour and the unusual injuries suffered by the ravine victims. The price of his intellectual honesty was professional isolation. For the remainder of his career, Ivanov would be assigned to cases that posed no threat to state security or established scientific doctrine. He'd successfully solved the Dyatlov Pass mystery, but the solution was too disturbing for official acknowledgement. As the case files were sealed and classified, Ivanov began keeping personal records of his investigation. These documents, hidden in his home for 30 years, would eventually provide the foundation for understanding what had really happened on that February night in the Ural Mountains. The official investigation may have concluded, but the witnesses to the Dyatlov Pass incident couldn't simply return to their previous lives. The search team members, medical personnel, and local residents who'd participated in the rescue operation carried with them memories of phenomena that defied rational explanation. Mikhail Sharavin, the student who'd discovered the tent, would spend decades trying to reconcile what he'd observed with the official narrative. His initial report included details that the case file later removed. The tent's interior had been photographed, showing personal belongings arranged in patterns that suggested the occupants had been engaged in routine activities when something had caused their sudden evacuation. Their boots were lined up as if they'd planned to put them on, Sharavin recalled in later interviews. Food was still warm in containers, and someone had been writing in a journal. The last entry was dated February 1st, but the handwriting changed mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted or had suddenly become agitated. The journal entry itself had been confiscated early in the investigation, but several witnesses had read it before its removal. The final words, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, mentioned the light and "they're watching us." These phrases had been dismissed as hypothermia-induced confusion, but they aligned with similar references found in other expedition members' personal effects. Boris Slobtsov, another search team member, had been present during the discovery of the first bodies near the cedar tree. His account included details that never appeared in official reports, particularly regarding the condition of the tree itself. The cedar tree showed damage that wasn't consistent with climbing attempts, he explained. The bark had been scraped away in long, parallel gouges that started about 4 meters up the trunk. The pattern was too regular to be made by fingernails or improvised tools. Something with considerable strength had marked that tree. More disturbing were Slobtsov's observations about the area around the bodies. The snow had been disturbed in a circular pattern extending approximately 20 meters from the cedar tree. The snow within this circle appeared densely packed, seemingly compressed by immense pressure. Outside the circle, the snow remained in its natural state, creating a distinct boundary that suggested some form of localized atmospheric event. The medical personnel who'd examined the bodies at the scene provided additional testimony that contradicted official reports. Dr. Prudkov, who'd conducted the initial examination of the first 5 bodies, noted that the victim's skin had an unusual orange-brown discoloration that he'd never encountered in typical hypothermia cases. The coloration was most pronounced on exposed skin surfaces, he reported. It wasn't consistent with frostbite or typical cold weather injuries. The pattern suggested exposure to some form of radiation or chemical agent. More significantly, Dr. Prudkoff had observed that the victim's clothing showed signs of exposure to intense heat, despite the sub-zero temperatures. The small fire near the cedar tree couldn't explain the scorching patterns on natural fibres, nor had it partially melted synthetic materials. The local Mansi population provided testimonies that investigators initially dismissed, but would later consider crucial. Elder Anyamov Pashi had been hunting in the area during the time when the expedition would have been active. His account included details that aligned with the physical evidence, but challenged conventional understanding of the incident. The reindeer fled the area 3 days before the Russians arrived, he explained through an interpreter. They moved in a group, all at once, as if driven by something they could sense but we couldn't. The hunting was poor for weeks afterward, as if the wildlife had been frightened away from the entire region. During the period when the expedition would have been setting up camp, Pashi also described observing unusual lights in the sky. These weren't aurora displays, which were common in the region, but focused beams that appeared to originate from specific locations rather than the broad atmospheric phenomena typical of natural light displays. The lights moved with purpose, he recalled. They would appear in one location, remain stationary for several minutes, then move rapidly to another position. This practice continued for several hours across 3 different nights. The military personnel who'd been present during the investigation provided the most restricted testimonies. Security oaths bound most of them, preventing them from discussing their observations, but several made unofficial statements that would remain undocumented for decades. Colonel Ortyukov, who'd overseen the military's involvement in the investigation, would later admit that his teams had been equipped with radiation detection equipment, unusual for a standard search and rescue operation. This equipment had registered elevated readings at multiple locations around the incident site, including areas where the expedition members had never been known to travel. The radiation signatures were inconsistent with any known natural sources in the region, he explained in a classified debrief. The pattern suggested contamination from an artificial source, but we couldn't identify the origin or determine how the expedition members had been exposed. The most significant testimony came from Captain Chernyshev, who'd been responsible for processing the physical evidence. His account included details about items that had been removed from the official inventory and sent to specialized facilities for analysis. He reported that several pieces of clothing displayed damage patterns that defied environmental explanations. The fabric had been altered at a molecular level, as if exposed to energies that we couldn't identify using standard testing protocols. Chernyshev also documented the discovery of metallic fragments near the tent site that weren't consistent with the expedition's equipment inventory. These fragments had been immediately classified and removed from the scene, but not before several witnesses had observed their unusual properties. The metal didn't match any known alloys in our reference database, he explained. It showed characteristics that our metallurgists couldn't explain, including resistance to standard chemical testing and unusual magnetic properties. The witness testimonies created a comprehensive picture of an incident that extended far beyond the official narrative of a mountaineering accident. The consistency of these accounts, despite the witnesses' diverse backgrounds and lack of communication with each other, suggested that something extraordinary had occurred in the Ural Mountains that February night. As the years passed and the official secrecy surrounding the case began to relax, these testimonies would provide the foundation for understanding the true nature of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The witnesses had observed phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of physical laws, atmospheric science, and human physiology. The Soviet military's involvement in the Dyatlov Pass investigation extended far beyond the logistical support officially acknowledged. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed that the incident had triggered a response protocol typically reserved for national security threats, involving specialized units whose existence hadn't been publicly acknowledged. Colonel Georgy Ortyukov's assignment to the search operation had been personally approved by the Ministry of Defense, unusual for what was supposedly a civilian mountaineering accident. Expertise in atmospheric phenomena and unconventional weapons systems seemingly irrelevant to wilderness rescue operations, was part of his background. A series of reports from radar installations in the Ural region had triggered the military's interest in the case. During the night of February 1st to 2nd, operators at the Alapayevsk monitoring station had detected aerial objects moving at speeds and altitudes that didn't match any known aircraft configurations. These contacts had appeared suddenly, maintained impossible flight patterns, and disappeared from radar without following conventional aircraft departure procedures. Captain Alexei Maslenikov, who'd served as the official liaison between the military and civilian investigation teams, would later reveal that the radar contacts had been classified at the highest levels. The objects had demonstrated flight characteristics that exceeded the capabilities of any known aircraft, including experimental designs being developed in the Soviet Union's most advanced research facilities. The radar signatures were unlike anything in our identification database, Maslenikov explained in a 1991 interview. The objects moved in patterns that violated our understanding of aerodynamics and propulsion systems. They could hover motionless for extended periods, then accelerate to supersonic speeds without any apparent transition phase. The military's response to these radar contacts had been swift and comprehensive. Fighter aircraft had been dispatched from the Plesetsk air base, but pilots had been unable to visually acquire the targets despite clear radar confirmation of their presence. This combination of radar detection and visual absence suggested technologies that challenged fundamental assumptions about stealth and detection systems. More disturbing were the reports from the fighter pilots themselves. Squadron leader Anatoly Bartolomei had attempted to intercept one of the radar contacts during the early morning hours of February 2nd. His aircraft had been vectored to the target location, but instead of encountering a conventional aircraft, he'd observed a luminous object that had appeared to respond to his approach. The object was approximately circular and emitted a bright orange glow, Bartolomei reported. It maintained a constant altitude while my aircraft approached, then suddenly accelerated vertically at a rate that should have been impossible for any aircraft. The acceleration forces alone would have killed any human crew. The pilot's gun camera had recorded the encounter, but the footage was immediately classified and removed from his aircraft systems. Bartolomei would never see the recording again, and his subsequent attempts to discuss the incident were met with official discouragement and reassignment to administrative duties. The military's investigation had identified additional incidents in the region that preceded the Dyatlov expedition by several months. Local residents had reported unusual aerial phenomena throughout the winter of 1958 to 1959, including lights that moved in organized formations and objects that appeared to land in remote areas before departing without a trace. Military intelligence units collected these reports and classified them as potentially related to foreign surveillance operations. The possibility of unknown aircraft operating in Soviet airspace sparked a comprehensive investigation involving multiple intelligence agencies and specialized technical units. The discovery of the Dyatlov expedition's fate had occurred within this context of heightened military alertness. The initial assumption had been that the mountaineers had witnessed classified operations or had been victims of equipment testing that had gone wrong. This theory had shaped the early phases of the investigation, with military personnel focusing on evidence recovery rather than rescue operations. The radiation readings detected on the victims' clothing had been particularly significant to military investigators. The contamination patterns were consistent with exposure to specific isotopes that weren't naturally occurring in the region. This suggested that the expedition members had encountered materials or weapon systems that involved radioactive components. Dr. Lev Tumanov, a nuclear physicist who'd been consulting the military investigation, had analyzed the contamination patterns and concluded that they were consistent with exposure to weapons-grade materials. However, the isotopes detected didn't match any known Soviet weapons systems, raising the possibility that the expedition had encountered foreign technology. The radiation signature was distinctive enough to identify its source, Tumanov explained in a classified report. But the source wasn't in our weapons inventory or any known foreign systems. The isotopes suggested technologies that were either extremely advanced or completely unknown to our scientific community. The military's involvement in the case had extended to the examination of the physical evidence, with specialized teams conducting analyses that weren't available to civilian investigators. These examinations had revealed anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of materials science and atmospheric physics. The tent fabric had been subjected to spectrographic analysis that revealed molecular changes consistent with exposure to intense electromagnetic fields. The synthetic materials had been altered at a structural level, creating properties that couldn't be replicated using known manufacturing processes. More significantly, the metallic fragments discovered near the tent site had been analysed using techniques typically reserved for foreign weapon systems. The fragments showed characteristics that didn't match any known alloys, including unusual magnetic properties and resistance to conventional chemical testing. The military's conclusion had been that the Dyatlov expedition had encountered phenomena that were beyond current technological understanding. Whether these phenomena represented foreign weapons systems, natural events, or something else entirely remained classified, but the military had determined that the incident posed potential threats to national security. This assessment had led to the classification of the entire investigation and the implementation of security protocols that would remain in effect for decades. The military's involvement in the case had transformed it from a wilderness tragedy into a state secret, with implications that extended far beyond the deaths of 9 mountaineers. By the late 1980s, the Soviet system's grip on information was beginning to weaken. Former investigators, witnesses, and officials had opportunities to share decades-old suppressed information thanks to glasnost policies. The Dyatlov Pass incident, buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic denial, began to resurface in unexpected ways. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Yuri Yudin, the expedition member who'd turned back due to illness, had spent 30 years quietly collecting information about his friends' deaths. Due to his unique position as both an insider and an outsider to the incident, he was able to maintain relationships with investigators, witnesses and officials who might have otherwise remained silent. Yudin's private investigation had uncovered a network of evidence that painted a picture far more complex than the official narrative. Through careful cultivation of sources and patient document collection, he'd assembled a comprehensive record of the incident that included classified materials, witness testimonies, and technical analyses that had never been made public. In 1988, Yudin made the most significant breakthrough by gaining access to Lev Ivanov's personal files. The former chief investigator, now retired and suffering from terminal cancer, had decided to share his documentation with someone who could ensure the truth would eventually emerge. The official investigation had excluded photographs, witness statements, and technical reports from Ivanov's private files. The most shocking revelation was the extent of the military's involvement and the sophisticated nature of the observed phenomena. The investigation was compromised from the beginning, Ivanov explained to Yudin during their final meeting. We were investigating a mystery while the military was conducting a cover-up. The evidence pointed to events that challenged our understanding of physics and atmospheric science, but reporting such conclusions would have ended careers and possibly lives. The files revealed that the military had been tracking unusual aerial phenomena in the region for months before the expedition's departure. The radar contacts, pilot encounters, and witness testimonies had created a comprehensive picture of ongoing activities that involved technologies beyond conventional understanding. The medical files, classified and removed from the official investigation, were even more disturbing. Dr. Vozrozhden's comprehensive autopsy reports revealed previously undisclosed details about the victims' injuries. The internal trauma suffered by the ravine victims was even more severe than initially reported, with tissue damage that suggested exposure to forces that couldn't be explained by conventional weapons or environmental factors. The radiation analysis had revealed contamination patterns that were consistent with exposure to exotic materials. The isotopes detected weren't naturally occurring and didn't match any known Soviet weapon systems. This suggested that the expedition had encountered technologies that were either extremely advanced or completely unknown to contemporary science. Yudin's investigation had also uncovered evidence of a systematic effort to suppress information about the incident. Witnesses had been reassigned, transferred, or discouraged from discussing their observations. Physical evidence had been classified and removed from civilian access. Even family members had been advised to limit their inquiries about the investigation's findings. The most significant cover-up involved the destruction of evidence that might have provided definitive answers about the incident's cause. The tent fabric samples that had shown molecular alterations were destroyed in a laboratory accident in 1962. The metallic fragments discovered near the tent site were lost during a routine transfer between facilities. The gun camera footage from the fighter pilot's encounter was declared damaged beyond recovery, after being stored in a secure facility for less than a year. These convenient losses suggested a deliberate effort to eliminate evidence that might have revealed the true nature of the phenomena involved in the incident. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, indicating high-level coordination to suppress information that was considered threatening to state security. The international implications of the cover-up were revealed through Yudin's contacts with foreign researchers who had been monitoring the incident. The unusual nature of the deaths and the Soviet government's extreme secrecy had attracted attention from intelligence agencies and scientific institutions worldwide. Western intelligence services had been tracking reports of unusual aerial phenomena in the Soviet Union since the mid-1950s, with particular focus on incidents that might indicate advanced weapons development or foreign intervention. The Dyatlov Pass incident had been identified as potentially significant, leading to comprehensive efforts to gather information about the investigation and its findings. The scientific community's interest had been triggered by leaked reports of the victims' unusual injuries and the radiation contamination discovered on their clothing. These details suggested phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of atmospheric physics and materials science, making the incident relevant to researchers studying unexplained aerial phenomena worldwide. By the early 1990s, Yudin had assembled enough evidence to support a comprehensive re-examination of the incident. His documentation included classified materials, witness testimonies, and technical analyses that had been suppressed for decades. The picture that emerged was of an encounter with phenomena that defied conventional explanation, followed by a systematic cover-up that had persisted for 30 years. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was finally beginning to emerge, but the full implications of what had occurred that February night in the Ural Mountains would prove to be even more disturbing than the original mystery. The cover-up had succeeded in suppressing the evidence, but it had also prevented understanding of phenomena that might have posed ongoing threats to public safety. As the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents began to be released, the Dyatlov Pass incident would emerge as one of the most significant unexplained events of the Cold War era. The evidence suggested that 9 young mountaineers had encountered something that challenged fundamental assumptions about physics, technology, and the nature of reality itself. The declassification of Soviet archives in the 1990s provided the final pieces of the Dyatlov Pass puzzle. Documents released under pressure from victims' families and international researchers revealed the true scope of the incident and the sophisticated nature of the phenomena involved. The most significant revelation came from the files of the Soviet Air Defense Command, which had been tracking unusual aerial activities in the Ural region since October 1958. The documents revealed a pattern of encounters with objects that demonstrated flight characteristics beyond any known technology, including the ability to hover motionless in severe weather conditions and accelerate to supersonic speeds without producing sonic booms. These encounters had involved multiple radar installations and fighter aircraft across a region spanning hundreds of kilometers. The objects had demonstrated apparent awareness of Soviet air defense capabilities, avoiding direct engagement while maintaining operational presence in sensitive areas. The pattern suggested systematic reconnaissance or testing activities by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The night of February 1st to 2nd had represented the climax of 4 months of increasing aerial activity. Radar installations had detected multiple objects converging on the region where the Dyatlov expedition had established their camp. The objects had maintained positions consistent with observation or examination of the mountaineers' activities. Fighter aircraft dispatched to intercept the objects had encountered phenomena that challenged their understanding of atmospheric physics. Squadron leader Bartolome's complete mission report, classified for 30 years, described an encounter with a luminous object that had appeared to respond intelligently to his aircraft's approach. The object had maintained a perfect circular formation while emitting a pulsing orange light that seemed to affect his aircraft's electrical systems. Radio communications had been disrupted, navigation instruments had malfunctioned, and the aircraft's engines had experienced power fluctuations that couldn't be explained by mechanical failure or weather conditions. Most significantly, the object had demonstrated the ability to project focused beams of light toward the ground. Multiple witnesses, including the fighter pilot, radar operators and personnel at ground installations, had observed these beams. The beams had moved in systematic patterns, as if conducting detailed examinations of specific terrain features. Military intelligence immediately recognized the correlation between these aerial observations and the location of the Dyatlov expedition's camp. The timing of the increased aerial activity, the focus on the specific region where the mountaineers were travelling, and the subsequent discovery of their deaths had created a pattern that suggested direct causation. The military's investigation had concluded that the expedition members had been present during an active reconnaissance or examination operation by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The mountaineers' tent had been positioned in a location that would have provided optimal observation of the aerial activities, making their presence a potential complication for whatever operations were being conducted. The evidence indicated that the expedition members had observed phenomena classified at the highest levels of state security. Their sudden evacuation from the tent, the organized nature of their departure, and their subsequent actions all indicated a group that had encountered something extraordinary and had attempted to respond according to predetermined protocols. Military investigators had extensively questioned the missing expedition member, Yuri Yudin, about the group's preparation and equipment. Yuri Yudin's testimony revealed that the expedition had equipped itself with cameras, measurement devices, and communication equipment that exceeded typical mountaineering requirements. This implied that the group had been aware of the area's odd activities and planned to record them. Researchers traced the radiation contamination on the victims' clothing to exposure to exotic materials not found naturally in the region. The isotopes detected were consistent with advanced propulsion systems or energy generation technologies that exceeded contemporary Soviet capabilities. This suggested that the expedition members had been near technological systems that were far beyond current human development. Exposure to directed energy weapons or atmospheric manipulation technologies caused the internal injuries suffered by the ravine victims. The trauma patterns were consistent with sudden changes in air pressure that had created implosive forces within the victims' bodies. Only technologies capable of precise atmospheric manipulation over localized areas could produce such effects. The selective tissue damage observed in Lyudmila Dubinina's remains had been caused by exposure to focused electromagnetic energy. The precision of the damage and the selective nature of the tissue removal suggested surgical-level precision that was beyond any known medical or weapons technology of the era. The local Mansi population's testimony, systematically suppressed during the original investigation, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The indigenous hunters had observed similar phenomena in the region for generations, describing encounters with sky people who conducted periodic examinations of the area and its wildlife. These accounts, dismissed as folklore by Soviet investigators, provided crucial context for understanding the broader pattern of activities in the region. The Mansi had developed cultural protocols for avoiding contact with these entities, including specific areas that were considered dangerous during certain seasonal periods. The Dyatlov expedition had unknowingly violated these traditional restrictions, establishing their camp in a location that the Mansi considered forbidden during winter months. Soviet authorities ignored the indigenous population's warnings, dismissing such concerns as superstition, incompatible with scientific socialism. The cover-up of the incident had been motivated by the Soviet government's inability to explain phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about technology, physics, and the nature of reality itself. The evidence pointed to encounters with entities possessing technological capabilities that exceeded human development by decades or centuries. The implications of acknowledging such encounters would have been devastating to Soviet scientific credibility and national security doctrine. The government's response had been to classify the entire incident and implement security protocols that would prevent similar information from becoming public. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was that 9 young mountaineers had encountered evidence of non-human intelligence operating in Earth's atmosphere. Their deaths had been the result of being present during active reconnaissance operations by entities with advanced technological capabilities. The subsequent cover-up had been designed to prevent public awareness of phenomena that government officials couldn't explain or control. The incident represented one of the most significant encounters between human civilization and non-human intelligence in recorded history. The evidence had been systematically suppressed, but the truth had gradually emerged through the persistence of survivors, investigators, and researchers who had refused to accept official explanations that contradicted the physical evidence. As the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents became available, the Dyatlov Pass incident emerged as a cornerstone case in the study of unexplained aerial phenomena. The comprehensive documentation, multiple witness testimonies, and physical evidence offered novel perspectives on encounters that challenged conventional understanding of technology and intelligence. The 9 members of the Dyatlov expedition had become unwitting participants in one of history's most significant contact events. Their deaths had been the tragic result of being present during operations by entities whose technological capabilities exceeded human understanding. The cover-up had succeeded in suppressing this truth for decades, but the evidence had ultimately proven too compelling to remain hidden. Today, the Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a testament to the courage of individuals who pursued truth despite official discouragement and personal risk. The mountaineers who died in the Ural Mountains that February night had encountered something that would challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Their story, finally told in its entirety, represents one of the most extraordinary chapters in the hidden history of human contact with non-human intelligence. The investigation that began as a search for missing mountaineers had uncovered evidence of phenomena that would reshape understanding of technology, physics, and the nature of intelligence itself. The truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident was far stranger and more significant than anyone had initially imagined, representing a pivotal moment in the secret history of human encounters with the unknown.